Hey guys, RPG guy here, and I've been wanting to do this show for a while, and I've never really gotten around to it for variable reasons, work mostly, and that these episodes are very, I'm not playing a game. I'm talking about games. And sometimes in my Let's Plays you hear me do it, and some people go, tell me more, tell me more. And I said, I'll do it in a show. And so here's the show, RPG Guy Talks. And I figure what good way to start than something that's been talked about to death, but everybody has their own interpretation of it for various reasons, and they come from various places with it. And a good place to give you guys a good understanding of where I get my information from, and where kind of fell in love with RPG games, you're going to learn where that came from as I talk about the company, this Squaresoft's flagship franchise, Final Fantasy. We're not going to talk about the other games Squaresoft made. We're not going to talk about other games. Outside that, we're going to talk specifically about Final Fantasy as a franchise. I'm not going to focus on the Game Boy games. I'm not going to focus on the Final Fantasy side games. Legitimately, the numerical Final Fantasy games and some of their sequels as we see them show up later in the game, in the series. And once we get through that, you'll find out how I feel about that franchise and how I interpret what they're doing even today as opposed to where they came from, a lot of that stuff. I'm not going to mention all the people who worked on the games. We all know who they are. Uematsu, Sakaguchi, the list goes on. Okay? And so, and I'll talk about those changes as they come. So, how do I feel about Final Fantasy as a franchise? This is the greatest RPG franchise of all time. That's always a good question. I don't think it's the greatest. I really don't. There's a lot of great franchises out there that some of them do things better than Final Fantasy, literally to a letter. And some of them, have surpassed Final Fantasy and they've never gotten to that level. But in same retrospect, what did Final Fantasy and Squaresoft specifically do? They did good marketing decisions early on in their career. So really quick, before we go and dig into Final Fantasy 1, where did Squaresoft come from? Well, if you get a chance to check out Angry Video Game Nerd, or you check out like Nintendo Punk, or some of those other channels I'm shouting out to them. If you don't know who they are, I'm surprised actually. They have played, a lot of them have played games that came from Squaresoft before the age of Final Fantasy. I can't name them off the top of my head, but they were shit. Okay, everybody knows they were shit. Even Pro Jared did one. They sucked. They were horrible. So, Squaresoft had one final game they were going to try to push. What game was that? Final Fantasy. Why was it Final Fantasy? Because it was their final chance to not fuck up in the industry. And obviously it was a success. Now, did they do anything unique? What did they do that promoted the game? The same shit that they honestly do today. Final Fantasy, the first Final Fantasy really didn't do anything that extraordinary over, let's say, Dragon Warrior, Dragon Quest. And so when we compare the two, yeah, Dragon Quest came first. So throw the idea that Final Fantasy did it first out the window. They didn't. They literally kind of ripped off what Dragon Quest did, and they improved it. They went and took it a step further, which if they would have done by today's standards, they would have been sued out the ass and not exist. But what they did was brilliant. And this is where you get these two contrasting ideas. You have Final Fantasy, Mother, and Dragon Warrior. And there's some other RPGs in the middle of there at that time, but these were the three top-selling RPGs on the Nintendo, okay, in Japan. How do I know this? I actually own a Super Famicom. I'm that much of a nerd, and that's another story. I'll tell you that story when we get to Final Fantasy 2. So, Final Fantasy 1 didn't create the system, but they improved upon it. They gave you more options. You could choose your classes. You could mix and match your party, though, any kind of setup you wanted. They also showed huge jump progression, okay? You had the rat's tail at Bahamut, so your characters were not mages anymore, they were wizards. Your fighter was a knight. Your thief was a ninja. Your monk was a master. They all was like a promotion system used in the Shining Force games. you were promoted to a new frontier of strength and power. And, you know, that keeps concepts up. Now, how did they become so successful? Like I said, the mechanics were much more solid and tolerable than Dragon Quest was. Dragon Quest, you had more random battles. The storyline was not as intricate. And now, I'm picking hairs at this. You have to remember, Nintendo RPGs, and even Sega Master System RPGs were, by today's standards, horrible at story development, okay? Story development was you go to castle, fight Dark Lord. There's a little bit of stuff going on in the middle. And obviously, Final Fantasy I's big claim was, we've got the 4 elemental crystals. And that was their staple. And that's what we see in all of the Final Fantasy games, literally up to 6. And that's where it kind of stopped for a while. Okay? But that's what they were doing. Okay? All the way up to Bravely Default, that's what they were doing. Okay? And they cycled it to the point that your nose bled, and some people didn't like it. And, oh, it's another story about the crystals. Huh? But it was their staple, and at least they kept it interesting enough that they could recycle that principle ad nauseum. So let's get into it. What Final Fantasy did that Earthbound, Zero, Mother, and what Dragon Warrior did was it had a better presentation. It had a better fighting system that actually had animation involved, where if you've played Mother 1 and you've played Dragon Quest, you know that there's no animation involved. It's all still shot in numbers. With them, yeah, there's numbers, but there's moving boxes. Active characters doing motions and animations. So their visual presentation was better. I liked the music in Final Fantasy better than I liked it in Mother, and I liked it better than in Dragon Quest. And people will argue what they want, and that's true, but we see them do it better and better every time they sit down and do it. And this is going to be a staple of Final Fantasy games. They keep raising their personal bar on the visual and on the music presentation, with a few detours here and there, but that's kind of the one thing that stays consistent. And they start raising that bar every time they accomplish it, a new Final Fantasy game. There are, like I said, there are points where that doesn't happen, but Final Fantasy, that was their thing. They kind of ripped off a lot of other people's ideas, refined it and improved upon it to the point that it literally saved the company. Do I condemn them for that? No, not really, because they did it really well. That would be like Battlefield saying Call of Duty ripped us off and stole our idea. It's like, the idea has been around for a while. You just did a similar format with a similar outline. Okay, you're not doing anything that original, but you're not doing anything that but you're not really doing it to the point where it looks like you're stealing. And so that was their name. I've always felt that, like, for me, Earthbound had a much more intricate storyline than Final Fantasy did. Okay? Dragon Quest had all the fundamentals down that kind of lay out the path for RPGs today. Final Fantasy was the middle ground. And this is, again, another staple we're going to see in later Final Fantasy games, where they don't necessarily do one thing really, 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 really well. They do everything at an exceptional level. It's not the best I'd ever seen at the time, or better than what somebody else had done over here. They just did it good. And they hit enough areas and points that you could say, all around, they did the right thing. They made the right choices with what they wanted to do. So Final Fantasy 1 is not for everybody. It's more for retro gamers. If you want to hold the title of RPG elitist, you've obviously played it. If you haven't yet, that's one you need to put on your bucket list. And it was a good game. It was a decent game. It did really well, and it was the pioneer of the franchise. Now, we need to see where it went from there. Now, this is where I'm going to talk about myself for about a minute and a half. When I was a kid, my father was a big video game person, but he didn't like his sons involving himself in video games at the same level he did. So what he did, he used to be a kind of a dick to us. And you have to remember, I was, what, in first, second grade, kindergarten at this time when Final Fantasy 1, I think it was in first or second grade when Final Fantasy 1 came out, and Final Fantasy 2 in Japan was coming out. And my father, the first games I ever played were one of the Romance of Three Kingdoms games. I played Final Fantasy, I played Mega Man, I played this one game that I could never beat, and I can't think of the name of it. It was like Castlevania Simon's Quest, I think. I could be wrong on that one. And they were just and Zelda Link, The Legend of Zelda Link, The Adventures of Link. So Zelda 2. Those were the first games he ever gave me, and most of us know that those are not games you give kindergartners. You don't give them, or first graders. I think it was the summer into first grade. You don't give those to first graders and expect them to succeed in them. Well, I beat my dad at Final Fantasy 1. I beat the game before he ever did, and I also beat Romance of Three Kingdoms somewhat before I figured it out. Let's just say that before he did. I also beat Boy and His Blob, and he couldn't do that either. And so he started opening up more games to me. I beat, I think, all the Mega Mans at the time. I think Mega Man 2 had come out, and I beat that like in 2 days, which drove him nuts. He was pissed because he spent a lot of money on it. You know, for him that was a lot of money, and he wasn't happy about that. So he said, "All right, here's a new challenge for you. Since you're gonna play all these video games all the time with your brother, you have homework." And I was like, "What, homework?" And the fucker went down to the games store called Gameland at the time, that was around the corner from where I lived almost, and he bought a Famicom, because Gameland at the time, and actually until they closed, they dealt in import games as well as regular video games. He bought me a fucking Famicom, which is the Japanese Nintendo, and this will happen later. He bought me a Super Famicom as well. It stopped after that though, but with a few exceptions. And he'd buy me these games in Japanese. He bought me Final Fantasy 2 was the first game he bought me. He gave me that and a Japanese to English dictionary. And it was the kanji dictionary, not the how to say it and speak it. And he said, "Have fun with that." It was rough. It was really hard to play. But I did have a friend, Yoshi Tanaka, if you're out there. You're fucking awesome, bro. He used to come to my house, and he was a Japanese foreign exchange, like not a foreign exchange student, but he was ELL or ESL, English second language kid, and he was my seat partner in third grade all the way through middle school. And he used to come over to my house, and we used to play Mother. We used to play Final Fantasies 2 and 3, and I'd help him with his English, and he'd help me with with Japanese reading. Kind of read it to me and just told me what it said, and showed me in the dictionary what the words were, and I helped me with that. And so we were playing Final Fantasy 2 and later Final Fantasy 3. So I think I went on a little longer than a minute and a half, but that's how this started. So I had a Super Famicom. I was the uber nerd of my area. My friends come over and go, "The fuck is that?" "Japanese Nintendo. I get games that you never will get." And then they try to play the games, and they couldn't read them. There were some cool games that never came out in the U.S. Anyway, when I would play these games, when I played Final Fantasy 2, this is where something was interesting. The visual improved, the graphics improved a bit, but they weren't really. I think what happened was there was a lot of backlash from there in Japan. There had to have been, because there's no reason for them to do this, other than there was backlash for them kind of ripping off Dragon Quest. And so they set out to make their own engine. And what they did, which to me was a game kill for a lot of people, was they said it looked good on paper, but in practice it didn't work very well, was, "Oh, your characters develop based on how you use them in the game." which opens up huge opportunities for you to do whatever you want. Ooh, that's cool. That's awesome. That sounds like an amazing idea. Now program it. And that's where shit went south pretty quick. Story-wise, they started really developing a lot better. You actually had characters with a purpose who had their own voices. Not literal voices, but they had their own discussions amongst themselves. You conversed with other people. You had characters leave and exit your party off and on throughout the game, you started really developing. They started really developing what made them famous later. And again, like I said, graphics and music were an improvement. Story quality was an improvement, though I didn't like the memorization thing in there, where you could memorize words and then use them to ask questions to other people. You ended up going through every fucking thing on that list. Every single time you talk to somebody, when that list fucking popped up, you just asked them everything on it just to make sure you, oh, heaven forbid, I miss a fucking word memo or something. So that was a little monotonous. We never see it again in the franchise after that, so I forgive them for that. I don't really forgive them for their battle system. Like I said, it probably sounded great on paper, and even as I say it to some people, oh yeah, you develop the characters however you want. If you want to be mages, you have to have them cast magic all the time. And then you have them cast specific types of magic all the time to get better at that magic style. Oh, that sounds pretty cool. Yeah, it sounds cool, but when you're sitting there casting Fire 1 60 fucking times to level up your black magic skill, you start kind of losing interest. Or you're wondering why your mage still has 90 HP because he's not getting hit enough. Because most of the time you put your mages in the back row. By default, that's just the way you did things. And if you build this stat up, this stat would drop. And it's a lot of micromanaging. And being a non-native Japanese person and not reading Japanese very well, being a big fat white dude, no, I'm just kidding. But being a big white dude, trying to read Japanese was not something you could just pick up and do. So when I grabbed the manual, you know, my friend would explain it to me, but I didn't always understand what he was saying, and it was a struggle. As I played English translations later of the game, it was the same shit. I still felt the same. The story, again, an improvement upon the first Final Fantasy in many ways, but the battle system just nosedived. Like I said, sometimes just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should, and just because it sounds like a good thing to do doesn't mean that in practice it's really going to work. Like, you know, communism. It sounds good on paper if you follow it to the letter, but very few people who were communist ever did that. And that's why it failed for a lot of other countries, or is troublesome to countries currently today. Anyway, enough about that. Final Fantasy III. Final Fantasy III I bought at the same time I picked up Mother. And I have to say I did play Mother a bit more than I played Final Fantasy III. But Final Fantasy III for me was, again, another step in the right direction with music and graphics, and the story got better. They were killing off characters. You know, I forget if they did that in 2 or not. And even if they did, it wasn't that memorable as it was, I believe, in 3. And the stories became more, even stronger developed. Were they good? Not by today's standards, at least for me, but they were good for their time, and they didn't necessarily age well, but they were good. They were good. The one thing they did improve upon was they improved upon their battle system, in which it's a job system. It is the worst job system to ever grace a Final Fantasy game, but it was the first one they ever did. But what ended up happening was, once you found a job that you liked, you never really got off of it, did you? I always had a white mage in my party. I always had a black mage in my party. I rarely strayed from those paths. I picked up, I mean, I changed them out eventually, but, you know, that was kind of the problem, was you had all these classes to choose from, which wasn't a lot, but you had a whole bunch to choose from. And it never really went anywhere than that, you know, and what ended up happening was what exactly happened in the 2 previous Final Fantasies. What's my first Final Fantasy party outlook? Well, I have a fighter, a thief, a black mage, and a white mage. Why? Because red mages suck, and monks are okay, but the thief payoff is better, in my opinion. You know, and that's just the way I play. That's my style. I have the one tanky, beefy, fucking beefed out, you know, fighter, the Conan, the Barbarian, or I used to call them, as I got older, I ended up naming my warriors Rapetor the Barbarian, because, you know, instead of kill, they only know the word rape, and so rape replaced kill, and so whenever they see a bad guy they have to kill, they just look at him and go, rape. Rape. I know rape's not funny, but it was just this kind of thing that it made me think of, or crunk smash, you know, if you want to think of it that way. And, you know, so that was that. Thieves, I liked the speed. I liked the character I could rely on to go before other enemies did. Having that perk to me was better than having a monk who just had a shit ton of HP, but never the armor just to keep that HP high, which ended up draining the fuck out of my white mage. So you can see where I'm going with this. It's, to me, not the greatest direction to go. It's fine. It balances out eventually in Final Fantasy, and that's cool. The white mage, obviously, you're healer, and if you're going to have a designated healer, he better be one damn hell of a good healer. Okay, and same with black magic. It's the same principle. I want a black mage. I want to have access to all the black magic spells, and I want a guy that's going to be decked out enough to cause the most black magic damage. To me, a red mage is more a replacement for a thief. Not I don't really find them to ever be replacements for the other two mage archetypes, and I don't really find the monk to be, as you heard me say before, I never liked it. So this is a staple that I started following in all of my Final Fantasy build your party games. Final Fantasy 2, I designed one character to be roguelike. I designed 2 mages, and I designed one beefy, slaughter machine. Flat out. White mage carried more weight than a black mage did in Final Fantasy 2 for me. So if you're wondering how I did my layout, you can figure it out from there. Farion was obviously the roguish type. What was it? Maria, I think, was the white mage, and Gus was my warrior beef, Lex Luger, crunk smash character. And ironically, by default, they kind of started that way anyway. Where once I got the permanent 4th character, I started branching out with Farion into the direction I wanted him to go. Because now I have a designated black mage that I now had to train. With that said and done, moving along. Final Fantasy 3, again, same principle. A tank, a healer, a blaster or bomber, black mage, and your roguish jack-of-all-trades-ish kind of whatever you need him to do. But you want him to be fast, because that way he can utilize anything that needs to be utilized by a fast character, so on and so forth. So we've covered that. All right, so of the Nintendo Final Fantasies, if you're a fanatic, you should definitely play the first one and the third one. You can kind of skip the second one, though. If you are a hardcore, I want to play every RPG out there so I can talk about them, I can be part of the discussion better, play 2. Go ahead and give 2 a try. You'll probably like parts of the story, but it's a very quickly forgettable game. I never found it to be that good, and this is where games like Mother started sticking out, because I even liked Mother over Final Fantasy 3 to some respects. And again, this is where we started seeing Final Fantasies kind of fade away into the shadow of other in light of other RPGs, and which might even explain why they never came out to the US. Probably, I like to think that, these weren't super successful in Japan, or, hey, they were successful in Japan, but they were complex. They were insanely experimental, and they didn't want to go on a grandiose scale with it until they had something they knew they could market and they knew would appeal to a vast amount of people, which Final Fantasies 2 and 3 did not do at all. They did not appeal to the masses. Honestly, in my opinion, I don't think they could appeal to every RPG gamer out there, where Final Fantasy 1 kind of did, because there was nothing else like it going on.